Major funding for this production is provided by American Bank of Lafayette, the financial choice of the 80s. Additional funding provided by the Friends of LPB.
Hello. My guest tonight is the United States Senator, the senior senator from Louisiana, the Honorable Russell Long. And this is the second part of a program that we're doing with Senator Long. Last week we talked to him about his early days. What was it like being the son of Huey Pierce Long? What was it like on the day of his father's assassination? And the program ended that Senator Long, at the age of 29, had become the youngest person ever elected to the United States Senate. And I thought that in this program, we'd ask the senator to evaluate some Louisianians, some national figures, and some international figures with whom he's dealt. Senator, let's start with Earl K. Long, Uncle Earl. How do you evaluate him as you look back and
Well, he's a very talented fellow. He had a great deal on the ball. He understood people. He understood what makes people tick, why people do what they do. He was a very hard worker. He was an ambitious person. He wanted to achieve something, accomplish something in life. I think that he had observed his older brother Huey, and he did, from his point of view, he didn't see why Huey should be able to achieve anything that Earl couldn't do. And he did achieve a great deal as governor of the state. He was very active in politics. He helped elect a lot of people, and he helped defeat a lot of people in government. But if you go back and review what he managed to achieve as governor, he did a lot of good for the state, and particularly for a lot of people who needed someone on their side. I have in mind a lot of less fortunate people who benefited from the fact that he put into effect programs that help provide school lunches for children, help provide better for the aged, help provide better care for people in mental institutions, as well as having a good highway program, which was far more productive than what most governors were able to achieve.
I'm of the opinion that a good public servant has to be a fearless man. You know, former Governor Jimmy Davis once told me that if criticism stopped a public official, to this day we would have no highway, no free textbooks, because he said that everything that he ever did, he said, was the criticism was monumental, and you kind of had to be able to take it. You subscribe to that?
Yes.
What did you ever have any hilarious experiences with Earl that you could share with us? What did you ever just bust out laughing at something that he said or did with you or to you?
Well, there's so many things that he said, had a way of saying and doing that would be comical at the time. I've, from time to time told stories about Uncle Earl and things of that sort. He did have a way of saying things that other people would think, but never dare say. Just like this time I've told about on stories which is, I think, was a true situation where he had more or less authorized people to go out and solicit money for his campaign, and some of these people later on, after he'd been elected, thought that the governor had committed himself to home rule. Now, what that meant for those particular people was that they hoped to do some gambling down there in that parish. And if the governor would not interfere, that they thought the sheriff would be tolerant and let them get away with it. When he got to be governor, he would not visit with those people, wouldn't see them. They couldn't get through to him. So they sent for the fellow who had taken their money to contribute to the governor's campaign, make him go in there and see the governor. He got in there and he said, Governor, I've got to go back and face these people. What am I going to tell them? And Uncle Earl said, tell them I lied.
That's a great classic Earl Long story.
Well, I thought about it, but if it wasn't a commitment that had to do with a home rule thing or something along that line, it's something he shouldn't have done. And he didn't do it. I guess the lesson of that would be, one, a politician shouldn't commit himself to do something that he cannot do. But on the other hand, if you make a commitment of something you should do, I guess it's better just not to do it than to go ahead and deliver on something that's wrong.
Was he a man, you were his nephew, was y'all's relationship uncle and nephew, or was it two professionals? Was it two politicians? How would you describe it? Or did it fluctuate? Was it all kind of things?
Well, you know, Earl had no children of his own.
Yes, sir.
And I think that he anticipated that I had some possibility. There's also another aspect of it in that he had differences with my father. He wouldn't follow Huey's leadership, and from time to time he would even oppose something that Huey was trying to do. And Earl thought he should have been governor to succeed Huey, and Huey wouldn't go along with that. So it wound up that Earl insisted on running for lieutenant governor, and Huey supported somebody else for the job, and Earl lost. And in the course of all that, he said something about Huey that Huey's supporters just didn't appreciate all and were slow to forget. So it helped Earl a lot for me to come along and tell people something that was true, that he and my father had made up their differences before my father's death.
You gave testament.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that was Earl's advantage, and I did that. I went around and spoke with him, and I made that point in speaking with him and speaking for him and helping him to be elected governor. Then thereafter, he supported me. But, now, in some respects, he supported me almost as though I were a son, you might say, or a stepson of his. Later on, when I began to have ideas of my own, I guess his reaction toward that was something like Huey's attitude might have been toward Earl, you know, that I should listen to him about matters. He told me one time about the situation down here in Louisiana. He said, Russell, if you're not running anything but a peanut stand, somebody's got to take charge and run it. Otherwise, you're going to go broke. See, and he felt that he was the one that should run the show down here. And now and then, I'd find myself taking a different attitude. For example, I thought after he had been governor for 4 years, and I thought he'd been a good governor for 4 years, but by that time, his popularity was at a low ebb. And I felt that he should just step aside. The Constitution at that time said that a governor couldn't succeed himself. Just go on out, and people would feel kindly toward him after he'd been out. If he wanted to come back and run again, come back 4 years later. But I felt that he shouldn't try to elect his successor. When I discussed that matter with him, I said, Earl, why don't you consider being a senior statesman? These younger people could come to you and talk to you about matters and seek your advice. He said, I'd rather be dead.
He wasn't looking to be a senior statesman.
So that was his attitude. He'd rather die with his boots on than be a senior statesman, you might say.
Senator, when you got to, or elected to the Senate, Harry S. Truman was the president, was he not?
That's right.
Yes. What was your impression of him? I'm very anxious to, because history is treating him well.
Well, he's entitled to that. And he always seemed to me to be a very warm, kindly sort of person. He was friendly, he's likable, and really, I don't know how people could know the fellow without liking him. Now, he was a sort that would get mad now and then when he thought people were doing something they shouldn't do, whether it's a matter of some art critic finding fault with his daughter singing when she made her debut as a singer, or whether he thought people were being unfair in judging his program. And that'd give him a bad time because he would snap back or fight back at them when they were giving him the worst of it. But all said and done, I think that he was a great president of the United States. His heart was on the side of the little people, And after all, those are the ones who go out and elect somebody president of the United States, and oftentimes they get the worst of it because the president doesn't deliver it to them the way they have a right. The way they would have a right to expect.
Was he the greatest president with whom, under whom you served in the Senate?
I would have to give it to Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon
I think
Johnson.
of the presidents I served with, I think Lyndon Johnson was the most talented. All things considered, I think he was the best that I served under. He got the worst of it in that Vietnam War. But, you know, after a while, you come to realize that these presidents are just human beings. They're not God Almighty. They're not a religious Messiah that's going to save all the people. They're human beings doing the best they can with what they have to work with. And I think each of them, in his own way, gives the country the best he has to offer. Lyndon Johnson was the most effective majority leader in the history of the country. He was a great parliamentarian, a fantastic legislative leader, and having been a great majority leader, when he became President of the United States, he was able to pass programs and get things enacted. Tell you the truth, he was so effective that he passed too many programs. The country would have been better off if he had, and he'd have been better off if he had spaced it more, passed certain things, and especially the key things that had to be passed for then, and leave some of the rest of it for someone else to do later on.
Did you ever aspire to the presidency? You had every right to, as much as anybody.
I never thought that that would be my bag. I just never thought that, A, that I would be president, and I wasn't sure I had the talent for it. You know, it's one thing to be a legislator. I think I can be a good legislator. I believe I have been. But the talents it takes to be a good legislator are different than what it takes to be a great executive. And I don't know whether I'd been a great executive. I just never felt that was going to be my bit. I felt that my role would be to be a good senator. I thought I had the talent to do that. And if I concentrated on doing that and didn't waste too much of my time trying to be something else, I thought I could be a great senator someday.
I think that historians are going to be surprised about one thing in your political career, is that you never ran for governor of Louisiana, which seems so natural. You know, my goodness. Did that ever appeal to you? Did that have any?
Well, Gus, that's how I thought it would be when I was younger, but the dates didn't fall the right way. The way it worked out, I was 29 years old when Earl Long took the oath of office. Now, he was still on the seat. As a matter of fact, when I came back after World War II, I thought Uncle Earl should have retired by then. I thought that, that he had had his day and he had been beat for governor. He'd been governor briefly when Dick Lesher was on, but then he'd lost a race to succeed himself, and had been beat for governor, then beat for lieutenant governor. I thought he ought to just get off the scene and let us younger fellows have our day. But he insisted on running, and he was tremendously effective at persuading people that you ought to see it his way, especially if you think about it long enough. I'd sometimes think of various reasons why I should and should not support him for governor. And if he'd come call on me, if I had about 6 reasons why perhaps I should support him, he'd hit all 6 in order of sequence. Psychological thinking what would make my mind react to his advantage. So he was on the scene. And that being the case, when he was governor, I felt, well, I can't succeed him. What am I going to run for? Well, I had thought I'd be governor someday and then do like my father did, run for the Senate after that. But there's a Senate seat that opened up. And while I was too young to take the oath of office when I set out to run for it, by the time you'd get around to being elected and going up there, I would be old enough. And so I ran for that Senate seat and managed to make that. Earl Long supported me, I supported him, he supported me. May I say that at that time, people might not recall you how it was. People said at the time that I had given Earl Long all my assets and he had given me all his liabilities because at that time he had passed a bunch of taxes, which he had to do. I don't think that he could have kept the faith with all these people that he had promised we were going to have a pension for the old people and the veterans bonus and and school lunches and all these different things. He couldn't have done all that without raising taxes. But that was the biggest tax increase at any one time the state had ever seen, and I was associated with him at that time. So it was tough being elected at that point. I made it by a very small margin, about 1%.
Senator, which president were you at most odds with thus far in your career? Who did you feel most adversarial towards? Was anybody that you just said, I
don't feel unkindly toward any of them. I guess I feel more kindly toward most of these Democratic presidents because I had a chance to work with them a lot closer. But frankly, I have a very warm feeling, a very kindly feeling toward Richard Nixon, which a lot of people may not have, because it's my privilege to know him. Many times he invited me down to the White House to talk about what he hoped to achieve while he was president. And it seemed to me that fellow was doing what he thought he could to try to do what was in the country's best interest. I didn't feel as unkindly toward him as a lot of people did about that Watergate thing, because I'd always kind of been led to believe that you ought to be loyal to your gang, loyal to your troops. And I never quite felt that if one of my friends had broken the law trying to help me, if I'd be the one to go down and report him to the cop or to the prosecuting attorney. But that's all history, you might say. But I've never known any president yet that I didn't feel I could work with if he'd worked with me. I've been privileged to know presidents a lot better as I have served longer, like when I was chairman of the Finance Committee.
Yes, sir.
If they wanted to get something done that had to do with Social Security or unemployment insurance or taxes, foreign trade, so much of that came through the Finance Committee that if they were going to be effective, they pretty well should be sending for me, and they did.
How about John F. Kennedy? What was your impressions of him in the brief time that...
Well, John Kennedy was a great president. He did not have the opportunity to pass his legislative program. I think it's for two reasons. One of them was that time ran out on him. He was assassinated after about 1,000 days. The other thing was that he had not had the experience as a legislative leader that Lyndon Johnson had, for example. And his program, for the most part, had to be enacted under a subsequent president, Lyndon Johnson. But he did point the way. He inspired people. He gave people a sense of feeling of their destiny, of what they ought to be trying to achieve in the world. He set a tone of moral leadership for the country that was a great asset to us. I helped to enact a lot of his recommendations, but most of that occurred later on when Johnson was president. Some of it occurred while he was president. You may recall that during his period, the country did increase in prosperity, you might say, almost every month. And the same thing continued while Johnson was president. I think that in terms of economic leadership, it was more effective during his 3.5 years and during Johnson's 4 years than it was at any other time, because every month we seem to be a little more prosperous than we were the month before. He did have a balanced budget during part of that time, too. I think during about, especially if you keep the books the way that they keep it now.
Senator, when you were first elected to the Senate, there was another young man elected to the Senate who I consider the greatest political figure I've ever met. And I haven't met that many, but I thought Hubert Humphrey was a top person that I had met in the political arena. What kind of man was he?
Well, he was a very kind person. He was as you know, a effervescent personality, and he just had a tremendous way about him that appealed to people, and it appealed to me. I imagine it did to you, too.
Yes, sir.
Everybody that knew him. I don't think I've ever known anyone who was any more articulate than Hubert Humphrey. Tremendously eloquent spokesman.
What kind of president would he have been?
I don't know. It's just hard to say.
Was he a strong enough man to be I felt that that those very qualities which you and I obviously loved in him, that kindness and that compassion, there was a lot of give in him, and as much as I loved him, I had questions about was he a strong enough man to say no or in that top job.
Well, let me tell you the problem I see with Hubert Humphrey, and I love the fellow and still do and revere his memory. But Hubert had a of saying what people wanted to hear. You
Yes,
know what I'm talking
yes,
about.
oh, it was wonderful.
Now, I've never seen an audience yet that didn't just think he was terrific, but he had a way of saying what people wanted to hear, and that was individually as well as to a big audience. And I'm afraid that altogether too often he was telling both sides what they wanted to hear, you know.
And doing it real well.
Yeah, doing it very well indeed. Now, there's no doubt in my mind his heart was on the side of the little folks. No doubt in my mind that's how it was. But I found myself wondering if Hubert were president, if he would have been able to handle that situation where his instinct was to agree with the last fellow he talked to, you know?
Yes.
And if he had done that, he might have been regarded being very wishy-washy, although he might have met the challenge. But who would know? When you really get down to it, who would know? Well, a fellow who had the way of telling both sides what they want to hear will be able to zero in on what's best for the country and to resist the temptation to go along with these other people who might have been the last to see him, you might say, before he had to take a position.
Did you know him at LSU when he attended?
Yes, I know him, and it's my privilege to recommend that he be on the team that debated the British debate team that year, and he was extremely effective. They would bring these fellows in there and be more effective than our team, but usually because they were more experienced, and they were older than our fellows who would be debating against them. Hubert was a graduate student, and he was more than a match for those fellows.
So he was a brilliant young man.
No doubt about it.
No doubt about it.
All the way.
I want to share a wonderful story about Senator Long that I came across in the research that we did on him. One night, noticing that all the Republicans had left the floor of the Senate, in the near-empty chamber, Senator Long solemnly moved to abolish the Republican Party. Is that a fact?
Well, I knew that wasn't going to happen, but I thought it'd be good to make Everett Dirksen realize that he had a duty to be on that floor.
That's such a one. I read it about 4 o'clock this morning, and I bust out laughing. What is your assessment of President Reagan as a man, as a politician, as a president?
Well, I think that he's a strong character. He is a conservative, as you know, and he started out as a liberal. And I think he feels that he's a better conservative because he just strongly differs with the liberals. I think he is as political as any man who ever occupied that office. I don't think he's ever stopped thinking about politics since he became president. But I think that he's a courageous man. He has the courage of his convictions, and I believe that he does really have the country's interest at heart. I do tend to differ with him on some things.
Of course. And
I personally do not think his fiscal policy, I'm talking about these enormous debts that he's running this country into, are good for the country. But I think a lot of his ideas are right. I think that he's correct in feeling, as I think he does, that we ought to be putting a lot of people to work who otherwise would be living on welfare.
Yes.
And I wish he'd implement that, not just by reducing the funds, but by coming up with a program where we will provide people an employment opportunity. That's called a sheltered workshop if you want to, but that would provide work opportunities for people who otherwise are going to be living on us as disabled, when they're not disabled, handicapped, but not disabled. I would hope that he would seek to implement that type of thing. I think he did the right thing in going down into Grenada. But his record is in the making right now. You know, you'll be able to judge in retrospect a lot better as to how you measure him as a president.
Will you ever write a biography, an autobiography?
I don't know. It all depends upon how long I live, I suppose.
You look wonderful, you know, so I think that there'll be ample time, I must tell you. But I just wondered if you know, you've got all this experience and have met just everybody in the world who's shaped the world, and I just wondered if you ever have the temptation to tell it.
I would like to do it sometime if I live that long, but I'm not going to try to do that while I'm serving as United States Senator. And I'm planning to serve a while longer, by the way, Gus.
No doubt, Senator. Let me ask you this. It's kind of a sad question because it's about a fellow Southerner. What happened to Jimmy Carter? Just briefly, what even staunch Democrats felt a sense of something amiss when it was said and done. What was the problem there?
Well, Jimmy Carter was a stranger to Washington. He ran against Washington, you might say, when he ran. So he was a stranger to Washington when he came, and he was a stranger to Washington when he left. And a lot of that is matters that I'm just not in a position to judge. I have no doubt at all that Jimmy Carter did the very best he could for the country. He is a very devout and religious man and a sincere man. I fear that in some respects it worked out to his disadvantage, and maybe even the country's disadvantage, rather than working out to their advantage, because I think from time to time he would tend to look at a problem and think that because he was satisfied that he was right about it, that other people should see that. And of course, you and I know that the other guy just might be right about it.
There's that slim possibility.
And you'd better keep that in mind, because now and then the area is in your court rather than the other fellow's court. You have to keep that in mind. He did some good things for the country. For example, goodness knows it cost him dearly. And it cost us a lot of Democratic senators and congressmen when he made us ratify the Panama Canal Treaty. He made us do it. We wouldn't have done it without him just pushing us very hard to do that.
We're running out of time, and Senator Long, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody in Louisiana for sharing the intellect, the compassion, and the history of Russell Long. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you so much, Gus. I enjoyed it very much.
Major funding for this production is provided by American Bank of Lafayette, the financial choice of the 80s. Additional funding provided by the Friends of LPB.